in public schools or many other places. So we do need to clarify a few very important facts that really are directly related to how the Genesis mandate was blended with the Great Commission during that time in the 1600s in Massachusetts. The Indians taught the Pilgrims some good agriculture practices, such as when you bury the seeds of a crop, you put your fish garbage with it, and the fish garbage acts as fertilizer. So if you have several herring for your family to eat, you eat the parts of the herring you like, and then you take whatever parts you don't want to eat, and when you dig little holes and put your seeds in the ground, you mix your fish garbage with that, and then you water it. You end up with a lot better plants, a lot better crops as your crop yield than if you use no such fish fertilizer. Well, the English returned the favor. They taught the Indians how to use hoes to break up the ground and to plant in rows and things like that, which was not a practice that was common among the Indians. So they both taught each other beneficial agriculture techniques, and the result was a win-win situation. And they weren't doing this for recreation, they were doing this to survive. They were doing this to have enough food to eat, and just the basics of going through the day and lasting to the next day required everybody to do a lot of working and a lot of cooperating, and they were a testimony as a Christian community to the outside world. And they had crises that made a difference and were noticed by their neighbors. And one of those crises happened when something happened to Squanto. Now, Squanto is the one Indian who gets the most publicity. Okay, of all the Indians who were somehow involved with the Pilgrims, it's Squanto who gets most of the spotlight. But it's ironic that Squanto really didn't spend much time with the Pilgrims. They met him March 22nd of 1621, and he died November 30th of the next year. So he was with them for between 1.5 and 2 years. So he wasn't even with them for 2 years. But during the time he was with them, he was their friend and he was their translator. And actually the first Indian that the Pilgrims met was an associate of his named Samoset, who didn't know English as well. And so 6 days before they met Squanto, they met Samoset, who talked to them in broken English and said, "Oh, I have a friend who knows English better than I do, and he'll be here soon." And so that's how they got to know Squanto. But the Indian who helped them the most was whom? I can see it on your faces. Hobbamock. That's what you were all thinking, and you're right. Hobbamock was the one who helped them the most. But let's think about Hobbamock and Squanto and how a crisis led to some very good things in that part of the world in the 1620s. Little background on this. Governor Carver entered into a friendship treaty with the Wampanoag Indian tribe, which tribe was led at that time by their chief, Massasoit. So he's called a sachem. That was the Indian word. The English called him the Indians' king. So if you ever run into King Massasoit, that's because the English were used to thinking of the top leader being a king. But anyway, probably we would say an Indian chief. So Massasoit liked the English and entered into a friendship treaty with them. Massasoit had a tribe that included members who didn't like that idea. And And the troublemaker is Corbitant. Corbitant basically sabotaged the friendship treaty and was able to get a following of Wampanoags and others who would be against the English. And of course, some of the English who they'd run into before they'd run into the Pilgrims were not very exemplary people. But but you had Corbitant and his men who decided that they were going to capture Squanto and Hobbamock. Why? Because they recognized that as long as you had two Indians who could translate English to the Wampanoags and others, that they could communicate and they could have an ongoing friendship, ongoing trade relations, etc. So they figured if we can capture the two translators and deprive the English pilgrims of their Indian friends who translate for them, we will be able to successfully interfere with the ability of the pilgrims to carry on friendly relations with the Wampanoags and other Indians. So Corbitant, with his men, they decide that they are going to capture Squanto and Hobbamock. And they almost do. That is, they halfway do, because they capture Squanto and haul him off to where they live. But Hobbamock escapes. So they grab Hobbamock, but he escaped. He runs back to Plymouth and he says, here's what's going on. Corbitant and his men have captured Squanto, but I got away. And they are trying to demonstrate that you pilgrims are enemies to the Indians. And so Miles Standish, who is the military leader, he's the kind of the security leader for the pilgrims, he says what we need to do is we need to have a special operation mission. We need to leave now, we need to travel during the night, we need to travel fast, and we need to do the best that we can to rescue our friend Squanto. We need to get to the village where he's being held. We need to figure out where he is. We need to, create a diversion or something. So, and then run around and check all the different little houses to see which one they're holding him in, or however they're holding him. But basically, we need to do the best we can to rescue him, and that means we need to go fast tonight, and we need to get there before the sun comes up, and we need to take adequate firepower, and we need to succeed in doing this. And so the pilgrims say, by the way, how are we going to know their leader Corbitant when we see him? Because it's always important to know who the leader is on the adversary side. And Hobbamock says, oh no, that's easy. As soon as there's a battle, you watch to see which one of their men is the first one to run away as fast as he can. That's Corbitant. All right, that's the kind of leader he is. As soon as there's a battle, he's out of here. Let the other guys take the heat. So that's what they do. They, Standish, who at that point was a widower, his wife had died recently, he led 10 men, including Hobbamock, who, by the way, Hobbamock at that point had become a Christian. And Hobbamock and Miles Standish became basically best friends. And Hobbamock said, I want to move my house to be right next to your house, kind of like a duplex. And so that my family can learn what it is to be a Christian family. Because I want my kids and I want my wives, plural, to learn the Christian way. Okay? Well, that's what Miles Standish had to work with. Anyway, they became very good friends, and they were lifelong friends. So they swoop in on where Squanto is being held. Corbitant, of course, escapes before anything else happens. They wound 2 of the Indian adversaries. They get shot by musket shot. And those 2 Indians who are wounded are taken to Plymouth for medical treatment until they are healed enough to where they can be returned to their tribe. Think about that for a while. What impact did that have? Okay, let's look at the dates. That happened in August of 1621. It was August 14th when this special op took place. Basically, a month later, September 13th of that same year, 9 sachems, 9 Indian chiefs of nearby tribes show up and they say, "We would like to have a friendship treaty with you." Why? Well, they've learned a few things. One, they've learned these English say we're your friends, and it's not just talk. Because when Squanto is captured, they hustle during the night to rescue their friend. It's like, it'd be nice to have allies that you could count on in an emergency, in a crisis like that. Maybe it'd be good to be friends with them. I mean, the Wampanoags under Massasoit, they're already friends with them. So, Pilgrims, we would like to negotiate a friendship treaty with you. So that, and we understand how this works, that if we're attacked, you come to defend us. And if you're attacked, we come to defend you. So we're in this together. And so that's what we want to do. And so the Pilgrims say, that's fine, but you realize it's not just us. Because we already have a friendship treaty with the Wampanoags. So in order for us to have a friendship treaty with you, you also have to have a friendship treaty with the Wampanoags. Because remember, we have to come to them if they're attacked. And they're going to help us if we're attacked. And so you can imagine one of those sachems going, well, now wait a minute. That's kind of that kind of complicates the deal, because whenever it's harvest time, we like to go attack the Wampanoags and steal their crops. I mean, we've been doing that for as long as I've been alive. No, we just want to have a friendship treaty with you Pilgrims. No, I'm sorry, that's not the way it works. You mean that's a deal breaker? Yes, that's a deal breaker. You either agree to be in a friendship treaty with us and the Wampanoags, or there's no deal. You drive a hard bargain. We'll get back to you on this. Don't take too long. We've talked it over. I guess we could live without attacking the Wampanoags. I guess we could learn to get along with them too. If that's part of the deal, we'll go along with that. And basically that's what happens to the 9 tribes. And so you end up with a generation of peace that was never experienced before in that part. Win-win situation. In fact, win-win-win-win-win-win-win situation. So when some secular speaker says, oh, it was terrible for the Pilgrims to show up and interfere with the culture of the Native Americans. You know, think of how they ruined the ongoing culture that they had. Yeah, they stopped a lot of bloodshed and a lot of theft and a lot of fighting and unnecessary tragedy in all of these families that otherwise would be experiencing a lot of hostility that they stopped experiencing starting in 1621, which isn't to say that you didn't have a few corbetants from time to time, and there's a war called King Philip's War, and I wish we could go into that. I'm just going to mention a few details of that real quick so that you'll realize that this was an ongoing challenge. Many of the Indians were becoming Christians, and King Philip, and I forget his Indian name, he was Massasoit's son, another troublemaker, and he did not like the Wampanoags being friends with the Pilgrims, and he had and I've forgotten his name because this is not part of my PowerPoint, but he had a right-hand man who was not a Christian, who was with him in all of his different activities, but his right-hand man's brother became a Christian, and Philip killed the Christian brother right in front of his brother who wasn't a Christian. That bothered the brother, whose name I can't remember. So much so that it wasn't long before he became a Christian and decided to avenge the death of his Christian brother. And so he teamed up with the Pilgrims, and by then the Puritans were involved. And King's Philip War is a study in itself. But the brother who became a Christian later ended up being the one who actually killed Philip. And he cut his head off, and he kept his head, and he kept it where he lived, and he put it on a little display, and he would charge money for people to come look at the head. Anyway, okay. Well, that's enough of the ambush and the capture and the rescue. But if you'll notice, it's just a couple months after that, because it's in September when you have the 9 tribes who work out the friendship treaties, and so that's September. And then when you get to early December, that's when you have the first Thanksgiving, where the Pilgrims host a lot of Indian friends, and that's become, a holiday that we celebrate. Well, what you have going on there is you have the sharing of the gospel with the Indian neighbors. And so that's your Great Commission. But you also have an aspect of the Genesis mandate, because if people are constantly killing each other, that conflicts with being fruitful, multiplying, filling the earth. Because every warrior who dies can't be a father of another child. And so by being peacemakers, the Pilgrims helped to promote the Genesis mandate as well. Okay, so that's some good that came to these shores through that. And that was an example of God working out his providence in the New World with people who were in motion, and in the midst of all of their daily activities and conflicts and challenges, they are experiencing the advance of the Genesis mandate and also the Great Commission. So the personal side of that, of course, is be thankful for the human family that God birthed you into, and then also be thankful for the forever family, the spiritual family that he puts us into by adopting us in Christ, which is our legacy. Okay, at this point, we're going to move on to the next. Hopefully I can do this quickly. All right. So for our second hour, okay, now this I will need to go a little bit faster on, because some of this is more deep scientific detail stuff, and that's not the highest priority of this message. Okay, so now we're going to think about how God shows how much he values variety by making different habitats after the flood, and different animals are suited for different habitats. So it's not, the phrase should not be survival of the fittest, but rather it should be survival of the fitted. That is, God fitted his creatures to live in the world that he wanted to be inhabited. And he fitted human creatures, and he also fitted animal creatures to live in these different habitats. Lots of variety going on. So that's what we're going to try to look at. And is this something that we should be doing? Yes, we should. Matthew 6 says, "Why do you take thought for raiment? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They toil not, neither do they spend." Jared Watkins helped me with this verse. Remember? So this was a study that we did some time ago. But what I would want you to look at, you see the yellow highlighting there, is that the verb that is used, what we're directed to do in this Matthew 6 passage, is to consider the lilies. Well, if you look at the highlighted part of that verb, that should remind you of the Great Commission. Because remember, the command verb in the Great Commission was make disciples, make learners, cause people to learn, train them is the idea. And so you have this this preposition that's stuck on the front of it, which adds emphasis. So the idea is, don't just learn, but learn really seriously, very seriously, intensely, thoroughly. Learn, study the lilies. So don't just look at them and go, oh, nice flower. That's not what this verse is saying. This verse is saying, look with great seriousness, very serious study at the flowers that God has made. And you're going to find that Solomon in all his glory was not wrapped around like one of these beautiful flowers. And if God puts that kind of beauty into grass of the field, which it's there today and tomorrow it's cast into an oven. If it's something that is that ephemeral, that transitory, it's just, there it is and then there it's gone. That flower, wow, that was nice and now it's gone. If God puts that level of care and value into the beauty of a wildflower, how much more do you know that He is caring about our need for clothing? And then, of course, if you look at the passage, He also talks about don't worry about food. He cares for the birds. He makes sure they have something to eat. And so He's going to make sure you have food. And I can't prove it, but I think that when the Lord was looking at the audience, that when He said, well, why are you worried about food? I think He was looking at the men. And when He said, why are you worried about what clothing you'll have? I think He was looking at the women. That's just a guess on my part. Okay. Now here's a similar passage, but it's not exactly the same. In Luke, and of course this topic is one that the Lord would have talked about on multiple occasions. And so it makes perfect sense that when He talks about the same topic on two different occasions, He would use slightly different words. Just like some of these PowerPoints I've used in previous occasions, and I've talked about them, with not exactly the same words. But here, if you look at the highlighted part of this verb, it has the idea of using your mind. But then when you stick the kata in front of it, that preposition as a prefix, it adds greater emphasis to it. So use your mind, but use your mind really seriously when you consider the lilies. And then he compares that to Solomon and his glorious clothes, and reminds us that we should not worry about clothing, or, if you read the rest of the passage, food. But the idea is, in the process of talking about this, the Lord said, use your mind in a very serious way to learn about these wildflowers. So it makes perfect sense that we study His creation with serious attention and not just in a very surfacey way. When we think about trees, God put a lot of work into trees. And so I'm going to give two examples of that before we move on to talking more about animals. But trees are real important. Of course, when you think about it, the Bible starts out with two very important trees. And Adam chose the wrong tree. And then he was hiding behind a tree when he knew he was a sinner. In fact, he and his wife were both hiding behind a tree. And then he has his sins forgiven, and so does his wife, because his Creator hung on a tree. And then, of course, we have the tree of life at the end of the Bible as well. So trees are very important. Well, in the book of Daniel, chapter 4, we have King Nebuchadnezzar, who has been humbled in a very amazing way. And part of that experience involved him having a vision of a tree. And he refers to how the tree had leaves, and it had fruit, and the fruit was food, and beasts of the field used it for shade. And here in Texas, we care about shade. If you can park your car in the shade during the summer, that's a good thing. And the fowls of the heaven dwelt in the boughs of it. That is, the branches of the tree provide a safe nesting place for birds so that they're not on the ground and vulnerable. And ultimately, all flesh was fed of it. Now, folks who don't think about food chains and food webs might think, oh, that's a little bit of an exaggeration. You know, all flesh are fed of it. Well, of course, this is a vision, but so not trying to turn a vision into a ecology lesson, but other than to say the trees and the other plants that are producing carbohydrates and also nitrogen compounds through what God has designed them to do, they are the foundation of the food chain and ultimately the food web, because without the photosynthetic plants, many of which are trees, you don't end up with vegetation that can be eaten by plant eaters, which in turn are eaten by animal eaters, and some of those are eaten anyway. And then of course when they die, you have your detritivores and you have your decomposers. The detritivores are basically garbage eaters, and then the decomposers are the garbage eaters of the garbage eaters. They're like second level garbage eaters. Anyway, you have food webs in which God is satisfying the energy needs, the food energy needs of all these different creatures, humans and animals, as well as the plants, and of course He's providing the sunlight which the plants need to do their thing. So it really is true that all flesh ultimately is being fed by what gets put into the food chains and the food web, and it's pretty amazing. The psalmist says, "For every beast of the forest is mine," and of course referring to God. That is, the psalmist is recording what God is saying. The cattle upon 1,000 hills. God owns it all, and He does amazing things in the forests, and the forests are part of the variety that God has given. And what we're looking at here in relation to the Genesis mandate is we're remembering that God wants us to fill the earth, that this is really important to Him. It may not be important to a lot of humans, but it is important to Him, and that's why He busted up the community at Babel and gave them 70 different languages and scattered them around the earth, because He really did want people to spread out and live, inhabit the earth that He'd gone to a lot of trouble to make it, to have the variety that He had. And He wanted that variety to be experienced by the human race. Forests would be one example of that, and there is greater variety of wildlife in different kinds of forests than in any other kind of land habitat. Okay, so just a couple little details for you to appreciate trees. Trees need water. Water is in the soil, and the root systems can tap into it. How do you get water that is down under the ground to go up to the top of a tree? That means you have to fight gravity. God has designed that to work. But if God did not design trees to have a mechanism that gets water that is below them to overcome gravity and get up to the top, it wouldn't work. And so the tree has a plumbing system that carries liquids up to the top, and then you have some plumbing, would be one way of putting it. You have some plumbing that's basically taking water and nutrients and minerals. And then you have other parts of the tree that are flowing sap. That is, it's a lot more it's a lot more complicated than mostly water. So you have the xylem and the phloem. And so without getting into too much of the detail, just look at the pictures and realize the inside of a tree is really a lot more complicated than you think. If you had to invent a tree that successfully gets water up to the top and also transfers whatever nutrients it needs from the top to the bottom, to the sides, through the branches, makes it all work, would you come up with something as complicated as this? Let's look at the smaller level. The first scientific research that I did at the formal level, which resulted in a scientific journal publication, involved what are called Kalos plugs in sieve plates of vascular plants. It's easier to show with a picture. On the picture the plumbing that's inside a plant. That is a plant that has tubing, plumbing. That's what a vascular plant is. It means it has some kind of flowing that you could call plumbing. And it doesn't just go from the top all the way to the bottom, or from the bottom all the way to the top, without any interruptions. Along the pathway, and I'm oversimplifying this, but imagine it's like a straw or a pipe. Every so often you have a plate that's like a sieve. That is, you picture a plate that is separating the bottom part of the tube from the top part of the tube, and this plate, it's not just solid like a plate, but it's got all these holes poked in it like you see on this micrograph right here. This is a scanning electron microscope photograph showing you the inside of a vascular plant. And this would be true not just of trees, but of bean plants or other vascular plants. So the sap is flowing through the plumbing, and what happens if the bean plant, I'll take bean plant because that's simpler. If the bean plant is standing like this and it's got little branches called tendrils that stick off, and this one keeps getting injured, and that could be an animal is gnawing on it, eating it, or it could be something is bumping into it, but for whatever reason, this little branch-like tendril keeps getting injured. That means if it's broken, the sap will flow out and it can be wasted, kind of like bleeding, okay? So if you have an injury on an appendage of yours, a branch, you know, our legs and arms are kind of like branches, and if you're losing a lot of valuable blood that way, you want to stop that. Well, God has designed something like that for vascular plants. And so what happens is some of the carbohydrates that are dissolved, and you know how when you put sugar into water and you stir it up, the sugar dissolves. But if you leave it there long enough and change the temperature, it might precipitate out and you get a little sediment on the bottom. Anyway, you have a carbohydrate that is inside the vascular plant that is in solution, and it's flowing through these little holes, these little pores. But God has designed the plant to recognize when it's being continuously injured, and when it does, those little carbohydrates that are usually dissolved change their shape and they solidify and they form something like a blood clot. It's like the plant's equivalent of a blood clot. Okay, so the sieve plates, they can regulate the plant's sap flow by how much and how fast, and they can also plug it up and basically seal off the flow that's going to one tendril that's always being whacked. I hate to admit it, but I'm going to go ahead and admit it, but I'm going to admit it really quick. The research I was involved in, which used federal government money, and I was just the lab assistant, okay? All these little bean plants were lined up on a big table that had a toy train set. And the toy train set, paid for by your tax dollars, would go driving down the track, and it would bang the little plants, the tendrils that were on one side. All right, that means I have to do this really quick. It would hurt the tendrils on one side of the bean plant, but not the other side. So one of the ways you could test how quickly the clotting took place was to cut off the little tendrils after it had been bumped so many times and compare that to the tendrils on the other side that weren't bumped. Look at that under a microscope, and your tax dollars were paying for the train set and the little bean plants, and there you go. But anyway, why is that important? Because God has gone to great detail to make a world with plants and animals that show His brilliance and how He cares for solving little problems to make things work, so that the whole thing ends up being an inhabitable earth that His favorite creature, mankind, can live in and can see His glory displayed in. And when you learn details of God showing His glory and what He's done as a creator, don't just keep them to yourself. Pass that on to your family members. Pass that on to your kids. Pass that on to your grandkids. Um, Proverbs says a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. Well, that's not just talking about money. Much more important than that is leaving a legacy of faith to your grandkids so that they can appreciate what kind of a God you belong to and that they need to know Him as well. So when we come back from the next break, we're going to look at deserts, prairies, and western forests. So hopefully we can be back by 8 o'clock or 1.